Ukraine's state emergency service says a fire at Europe's largest nuclear plant has now been put out. The fire at the Zaporizhzhia facility began after it came under attack by Russian forces. Local officials say the plant has been safely secured now. The International Atomic Energy Agency says radiation levels remain unchanged. It has activated its full emergency response mode because of the situation at the plant. The plant produces a quarter of Ukraine's energy needs. President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of trying to repeat the Chernobyl disaster, saying the incident underscored the need to stop the fighting.
If there's an explosion, that's the end for everyone, the end for Europe. Europe would have to be evacuated. Only urgent action by Europe can stop the Russian troops. Do not allow the death of Europe from a catastrophe at a nuclear power plant.
For more, let's bring in Dr. Charles Casto. He's a U.S. nuclear safety expert who is involved in containing the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. Dr. Casto, thanks for being with us. Tell us, what went through your mind when you heard that this Ukrainian nuclear power plant was on fire?
Well, obviously, Terry, that's a very troubling situation. There is no rational reason for an attack on a nuclear power plant.
Tell us how dangerous it is to have a war being fought near a nuclear power plant.
Well, obviously, that situation is troubling. However, as you've seen with the state media talking about that it's stable, the operators are able to deal with these types of situations. We've planned for these situations, and the design of the plant is very robust. Nevertheless, that is not a challenge that you want to present to anyone, to any operator at any nuclear facility anywhere.
What exactly do you have to watch out for? I mean, if tanks are firing, even if they're not targeting the plant itself, but somewhere near it, if a shell hits the nuclear power plant, what could happen?
The most troubling situation would likely be with the spent fuel that's stored in the facility, and that spent fuel is contained and has a containment structure around it, but nevertheless is a part of the plant and part of the fuel system that you would have to worry about. And we saw in the Fukushima case where the Earth attacked the Fukushima nuclear plant, that the operators were able to maintain safety of the spent fuel facility.
Is there any international...
The reactors themselves...
Sorry, go ahead, sir.
The reactors themselves are obviously very robust and contained deep in the plant, and it would be difficult to have a serious release. However, that's something we always are concerned with. The spent fuel pools are somewhat more concerning, and as I said, that we have been demonstrated that we can protect spent fuel pools.
Is there any international safety protocol for something like this, for nuclear power plants in conflict zones?
The IAEA has a response center, the Department of Energy, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States, and many other agencies, and they have been activated to monitor the situation, and there is remote monitoring of the radiation levels to be able to determine the severity of the accident or the concern that we have in Ukraine.
But it's not such that when fighting is happening around a nuclear power plant, it's not that they shut it down?
Yes, typically what would happen is, as if it was a hurricane or tsunami, prior to that, the plants would be shut down and safely secured at that point. Then what you have left is the fuel itself, which would be protected, but the plant itself would likely be shut down, or would be shut down by the loss of external power outside the facility. The plants are all likely shut down and secured.
Now, many people, not just in Ukraine, many people are scared about this situation with Ukraine's nuclear power plants being in the middle of a war zone. Should they be concerned?
Well, you should be concerned. The likelihood of it depends on the magnitude of any attack that might occur. And as I've said, it's extremely robust. The plant's extremely robust, and mostly it would be a area, as we saw at Chernobyl, and Fukushima would be an area around the plant that would be most susceptible to damage. However, after Fukushima and after Chernobyl, we learned a lot of lessons from those accidents and learned many countermeasures that we can take to minimize the amount of radiation release from a reactor, regardless of the accident that might occur.
Dr. Casto, thank you very much. That was Dr. Charles Casto. He's a U.S. nuclear safety expert.
Thanks, Terry.
Russia's media watchdog said Friday it had restricted access to several independent media websites, including Deutsche Welle. The tightening of control over the internet comes just over a week after Russia invaded Ukraine. Access to websites of Deutsche Welle, BBC, and various independent Russian news websites are being limited. Well, let's take a closer look at events in Russia with DW Russian Affairs analyst Konstantin Egert. He joins us now from Tartu in Estonia. Konstantin, Russia has been restricting access to independent media. Can people in Russia still get uncensored information about the war?
Yes, Terry, but it's increasingly difficult. Just actually 15 minutes before I went on air, several reliable Russian Twitter personalities in whose the veracity of whose reports I can't doubt, started saying that Twitter is now probably in the process of being blocked, and you can't open your Twitter feed unless you use VPN or Tor or any other sort of bypassing device. So it seems that we are, at least it starts to look as if Russia is moving towards a complete blockade of at least social media. Apart from probably the Russian social media like Kontakte, which is a Russian version of Facebook, which is essentially controlled by the government and controlled by the FSB, the Russian Security Service, where content, unwanted content, can be removed. So I think that we've entered very quickly a stage in which Russia is kind of rolling back in time, or rather trying to catch up with China, which, as you know, had internet censorship from day one.
So the people in Russia are being increasingly isolated along with the government. We do see some people, however, protesting around the country in Russia, Konstantin. How risky is that for them?
Well, it is very risky. The Duma, the lower house of parliament, adopted amendments to the criminal code, which now punish something that's very vaguely called fakes about the Russian special operation and actions of the Russian armed forces with up to, attention, up to 15 years in prison. So that's not a joke. This is something quite significant, although application of this law will probably be quite lax, because what you characterize as fakes is anything that does not conform to the government line. And I think that this will be quite problematic to put in jail everyone. But usually what Putin's people do, they imprison someone so that everyone else will fear the outcome and will keep silent.
We're hearing rumors, Konstantin, that the Duma may decide to impose martial law. Any truth to that?
Well, so the Duma is it has to be both houses of parliament, the Duma and the Federation Council. But I think that for now, it doesn't look likely, because there's a procedure, and Putin is a stickler for legal protocol. It has to be, I think, a warning of about 48 hours before such measure is taken. And it has to be really approved by the parliament. I think the parliament will approve, because it's just a kind of pocket institution, Putin's pocket parliament. But I think maybe they are trying to bypass it by just blocking independent information, because martial law is actually imposed only in a situation where there is imminent danger to Russian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Doing that would be admitting that something is badly wrong, and all the official reports are actually lies. I want to tell you, Terry, that the last time Russia was under martial law was during the Second World War. So it's going to be momentous, and it's going to be very, very problematic for Putin, both from the point of view of his image, and actually from the point of view of keeping the country together after that, because as we've seen, it's not a very competent military planning. So I think that maintaining at the same time martial law at home and a combat operation, essentially prosecuting war abroad, I don't think that the Putin system is as resilient as to withstand such pressure.
Well, that resilience will be tested with international sanctions beginning to bite, the ruble in free fall. Russians themselves are hearing, even from their own government, that hundreds of Russian soldiers have been killed. The Ukrainians say it's in the thousands. With these reports of the horror of war coming out and the sanctions beginning to bite, is opposition to Putin and the war likely to grow in Russia?
I think yes. You don't expect revolution tomorrow, although in Russia nothing is impossible. Absolutely nothing. Maybe speaking now and then in an hour we'll be analyzing completely something else. But I think that there were two things which were sort of markers for me personally. One is the fact that the board of directors of Lukoil, which is one of Russia's largest oil companies and oldest actually, issued a collective statement saying that this war should end. It's a bit timid, but it's very clear what they're talking about. And this is amazing because all such companies are completely pliant and completely kind of following the Kremlin line. The fact that a board of directors saying that, not just someone with individual conscience, I think that's probably a precursor of quite a few things like that to come. And secondly, IKEA ceased its operations in Russia from today. And yesterday, scenes, you may watch it on YouTube, scenes of actually people in Moscow mobbing IKEA. That was a sight which I never thought I'm going to see in my life. So the first, if you wish, the first people who will feel the sanctions will be business, as well as the big city middle classes, whose life will never be the same as long as the sanctions are there. I think eventually sanctions will start biting all other classes of Russian society because Russian sort of foodstuffs and drinks and even seeds for the agriculture. A lot of it is imported, and a lot of it is now being sanctioned. So it's going to bite. It's not probably going to be the collapse of the state, but I think that many, many, many millions of people will feel that their life has changed irrevocably.
Konstantin, thank you very much. That was our Russian affairs analyst, Konstantin Egat. Numerous cities are under heavy bombardment by Russia, but still remain under Ukrainian control. The Black Sea port of Kherson is the only major urban center to fall since Russia began its invasion more than a week ago. Ukraine and the U.S. accuse Russia of deliberately hitting civilian targets during its attacks. Meanwhile, civilians all over the country strengthen their resolve to fight back.
All over Ukraine, people are getting ready to fight. In Lviv, those with combat experience teach those who have never held a gun before.
I came here to get some understanding of what to do, how to defend myself, and how to survive if the enemy comes.
And while it's still calm in Lviv, devastation elsewhere could give an indication of what could come. This is what the outskirts of Kiev look like. With Russian forces advancing in the east and south, President Vladimir Putin claimed that his so-called special military operation is going to plan.
Russian soldiers and officers are acting bravely, like true heroes. Our troops fight with persistence and full understanding that their cause is right.
In the south, Russian troops and their tanks have taken control of the key Black Sea port of Kherson. They are also pressuring the port city of Mariupol. There's no water or electricity in the depths of winter. To the east, Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, is still standing despite Russia's advances. But heavy bombardment has left buildings in ruins and dozens of civilians dead.
If we fall, God forbid, next will be Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, Moldova, Poland. and then they will go to the Berlin Wall.
Польща. І так будуть вони йти до Берлінської стіни.
A second round of talks between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators has met with some progress as the two sides agreed to establish humanitarian corridors in some areas. For those residents who have not or could not yet escape, any such corridors could provide some desperately needed respite.
DW correspondent Matthias Berlinger is in Ukraine. He's in Lviv in western Ukraine. Matthias, how are people reacting to the news, first of all, of that fire at the nuclear power plant? Are they worried?
Of course, people are worried about the news of that power plant. Ukraine is the first country that has experienced a nuclear meltdown. The Chernobyl plant is just 100 kilometers north of Kiev. That exploded in 1986, and people do remember this. So definitely there are big worries about that. The news there were shocking. For the past few days, people have gathered around that power plant to protect it. People, unarmed people, blocking the roads to that power plant in the case that somebody would come there. Yesterday, shelling was reported from these places, from these roadblocks that the people have. They haven't set up roadblocks. They have been standing there with their bodies to protect the power plant. So, and then they moved barricades on the roads, mostly like vehicles. And yeah, this is of course shocking. People have been aware of this risk for some time.
Matthias, give us the situation, give us the latest on the situation in Ukraine. Where do things stand this morning?
Lots of things going on. As every day, Mariupol is still encircled and under siege, and Kiev attacks on Kiev are ongoing in the suburbs of Kiev, and there is the fear that Russia might try to lay siege on the capital as well. That's the news this morning.
What about people fleeing their homes? I understand that over 1 million people have left the country, but there must be a tremendous amount of displaced people within Ukraine.
Of course, there are many people who have fled their hometowns and are now traveling either towards the western border or towards the southern border. So that's the borders with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Many people have left the country, as you said, mostly women and children, because men are prevented from leaving the country under martial law. So many men or families who do not want to split up are remaining inside the country in these safer areas, for example, here in Lviv, where I am now, which is one of the main escape routes out of the country towards Poland.
Now, Ukraine and Russia held another round of talks yesterday. They agreed on humanitarian corridors for people to leave. Tell us about those.
It's humanitarian corridors there for people to leave, but they're also to bring in supplies into the cities to feed the civilian population, to medication and all these humanitarian needs. There is, for example, I haven't seen any very specific ideas or plans to establish these corridors. I think the main thing is that they have agreed on establishing them at all. But for a city like Mariupol, for example, that has been under siege for quite some time now, this is of course something that's very important. And the electricity is shut off there, heating is shut off there, and no supplies coming into the city. So this is of course a very dire situation for this city, and a corridor is badly needed.
Matthias, thank you so much. Matthias Berlinger there, our correspondent in Lviv. All over Ukraine, it's civilians bearing the brunt of this military bombardment. And as we just heard from Matthias, for those in frontline cities like Mariupol, the situation is intensifying. For many, the humanitarian corridor may come too late. A warning, this report contains disturbing images.
Another shell hits Mariupol as medics wait for their next call.
But with phone services knocked out in parts of the city, they don't always know where to go. Often they go door to door, searching for anyone injured and in need of treatment. Here they find an elderly woman. Her house was hit by a shell. She's still in shock as she's taken by ambulance to a makeshift hospital. But sometimes help comes too late. Doctors were unable to save a 16-year-old boy struck by a bomb that exploded on a football field. Far away from the fighting, a plane carrying medical supplies has arrived in the Polish capital, Warsaw. The World Health Organization has sent 36 tons of aid, including surgical materials, to treat 1,000 people.
If the military conflict escalates, we're going to see many more really vulnerable people who are running away, who will need a lot of support.
But first, the cargo will have to be transported by road to places where the aid is urgently needed.
So I think I'll go back. Do you want me to go?
The supplies will be moved into truck to the border with Ukraine and then further to support the affected health system.
That means it'll likely be days before the medical shipments reach frontline cities. In Mariupol, which is under siege by Russian forces and cut off, it's already too late.
Meanwhile, the exodus of people fleeing the war continues, mainly women and children, as most Ukrainian men are required to stay behind to fight. Poland is receiving the biggest number of refugees, but other neighboring countries are also taking in people desperate to escape Russia's assault. DW's Tessa Walter reports from the Slovakian border with Ukraine.
A roof over their heads, even if it's just a tent, and a hot meal. Here in Vyshne Niemieckie, Slovakia, they've found shelter from the attacks of the Russian army in their homeland. Oksana arrived here from western Ukraine just a few hours ago with her 2 children. I was so afraid for my children. We had to flee. All of us had to flee. I don't know what to do now. Oksana is relieved that she's safe here for the time being, but she still can't comprehend the whole catastrophe of the war. I don't want to call myself a refugee. I want to go back home, where my children were happy. I want to. I'm just so scared. Lydia also just made it across the border with her children. She's afraid for her husband, who can't be with his kids right now, but has to fight the Russian soldiers. We are all worried. But what should we do? My husband told us to go, and then we went. We may never see each other again. This is not right. If we all have to die, we want to die together. It's not right that my husband is in Ukraine and we are here. You don't want to leave your home. Like Lydia and Oksana, thousands of women and children are fleeing Ukraine for neighboring countries. The families here are trying their best to hold up. Especially the mothers do all they can to shield their children from the horrible situation they are in. But when you speak to them a little bit longer, you realize just how traumatized they are by the war in their home country. Marian Letzo is one of the volunteers who takes care of them.
They are sad. It's not very surprising because yesterday they had normal lives and today they are here in Slovakia. And I believe they didn't plan to come here, so it's different for them. They have different lives now.
For now, they can only wait until their feet will be on solid ground again.
Joining me now is James Elder. He's a spokesperson for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, in Lviv. James, tell us, what does this war mean for Ukraine's children?
Well, very much what your viewers just saw. Deep trauma, separation from families, fear, and for an increasing number, it means the end of their life. We are seeing children being killed and injured in this conflict as things continue to escalate. So across the board, this is nightmarish for children, for very large numbers of children.
How can children begin to process the hell of war? As you say, it's traumatizing enough for adults. How do children deal with it?
You know, I speak to so many mothers here, and it's a mix. Some babies sleep a lot more as a coping mechanism. Some are in tears. Some are just frozen and steely. Others console their own mothers when their mothers can no longer keep up that facade of that strength. So it's a whole gamut of things, and it's an area that UNICEF knows, from Yemen to Afghanistan, now to Ukraine. I cannot believe we're seeing another nation. Children learn what conflict looks like, what an air raid siren is, but we know that the quicker this trauma can be addressed, the less chance it has of scarring these children. Of course, beyond our own efforts, the best way to end this trauma is to end this fighting.
What's being done to help these children, James?
A lot by everyday Ukrainians. I'd like to start by saying grandmothers on the street cooking foods, gifts of blankets to medicines, teenagers offering shelters for people who are coming in and have spent nights in bunkers and now are trying to flee. UNICEF, we have mobile child protection teams that will go both sides of the conflict line. As you and I speak, we're trucking in emergency supplies from our global hub in Denmark that are coming in to where I am, to Ukraine now. Safe spaces along those long journeys, a lot. But it's important to remember, as long as this conflict continues, that demand will continue to outstrip the supply. As your reporter said, 500,000 children fleeing their country in 7 days. That's unprecedented in scale, in swiftness, and to be honest, unprecedented in sorrow and stress.
Now, we're seeing most of these children arriving at the border, at Ukraine's border to the surrounding countries with their mothers, but some of them are unaccompanied. Where will all these children end up?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a very worrisome area of work. Now, on a policy level, UNICEF is very clear on what inter-country adoption should look like, on the best interests of the child, and Ukraine and those neighbouring countries are clear on these guidelines. So we ensure as best we can they're with a family member, an extended family member, someone from their village. These things are key. And then as a next resort, to find a safe place somewhere. This is not difficult. This is not easy, rather, given the enormity of numbers of people moving. But this is what UNICEF is seeking to do on all those border regions. Remembering, of course, there are tens of thousands of children in orphanages here. That's a great concern, because we've had reports that they're in the line of fire, or even children in hospitals. I was at a children's hospital here yesterday. Children in ICU, intensive care, on drips. How do we get them out? How do we get them to safety?
What about the long-term psychological effects, James? Is the trauma that these children experience likely to haunt them as adults?
Yes, it certainly can. If you look at that, they've spent nights in bunkers. As a little girl told me, there were rats in the bunkers. But her mum explained, but there's no bombs, Sophia. Yeah, yes, it is. Again, the sooner we can get out of this situation, the better. But they will need to be counselling. They need temporary learning spaces. They need any type of education that can give them a distraction. Whether UNICEF deals with this situation from Yemen to Afghanistan to Ethiopia, the longer these things continue, the more chance it has of scarring. This is a young nation, from what I see, a very entrepreneurial nation. These children will add so much value to any society, but of course they want to add it to their own home. They want to add it to Ukraine.
James, thank you very much for talking with us this morning. That was James Elder from UNICEF. And if you're just joining us, you are watching DW's special coverage of Russia's war on Ukraine. I'm Terry Martin. Here's a recap of the top news this hour. Ukrainian officials say Russian forces have seized the critical Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the northeast of the country, which produces about a quarter of Ukraine's power. Russian troops launched an attack on the facility overnight, leading to a fire at the plant, which is also Europe's largest. Ukraine's state emergency service says it managed to put out the blaze and secure the plant safely. Authorities say that radiation levels remain unchanged. The International Atomic Energy Agency says it has activated its full emergency response mode because of the situation at the plant. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of trying to repeat the Chernobyl disaster, saying the incident underscores the need to stop the fighting.
If there's an explosion, that's the end for everyone, the end for Europe. Europe would have to be evacuated. Only urgent action by Europe can stop the Russian troops. Do not allow the death of Europe from a catastrophe at a nuclear power plant.
For more, let's bring in Dr. Charles Casto. He's a U.S. nuclear safety expert who is involved in containing the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. Dr. Casto, thanks for being with us. Tell us, what went through your mind when you heard that this Ukrainian nuclear power plant was on fire?
Well, obviously, Terry, that's a very troubling situation. There is no rational reason for an attack on a nuclear power plant.
Tell us how dangerous it is to have a war being fought near a nuclear power plant.
Well, obviously, that situation is troubling. However, as you've seen with the state media talking about that it's stable, the operators are able to deal with these types of situations. We plan for these situations, and the design of the plant is very robust. Nevertheless, that is not a challenge that you want to present to anyone, to any operator at any nuclear facility anywhere.
What exactly do you have to watch out for? I mean, if tanks are firing, even if they're not targeting the plant itself, but somewhere near it, if a shell hits the nuclear power plant, what could happen?
The most troubling situation would likely be with the spent fuel that's stored in the facility, and that spent fuel is contained and has a containment structure around it, but nevertheless is a part of the plant and part of the fuel system that you would have to worry about. And we saw in the Fukushima case where the Earth attacked the Fukushima nuclear plant, that the operators were able to maintain safety of the spent fuel facility.
Is there any international...
The reactors themselves...
Sorry, go ahead, sir.
The reactors themselves are obviously very robust and contained deep in the plant, and it would be difficult to have a serious release. However, that's something we always are concerned with. The spent fuel pools are somewhat more concerning. And as I said, that we have been demonstrated that we can protect spent fuel pools.
Is there any international safety protocol for something like this, for nuclear power plants in conflict zones?
The IAEA has a response center, the Department of Energy, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States, and many other agencies, and they have been activated to monitor the situation, and there is remote monitoring of the radiation levels to be able to determine the severity of the accident or the concern that we have in Ukraine.
But it's not such that when fighting is happening around a nuclear power plant, it's not that they shut it down?
Yes, typically what would happen is, as if it was a hurricane or tsunami, prior to that, the plants would be shut down and safely secured at that point. And then what you have left is the fuel itself, which would be protected. But the plant itself would likely be shut down, or would be shut down by the loss of external power outside the facility. The plants are all likely shut down and secured.
Now, many people, not just in Ukraine, many people are scared about this situation with Ukraine's nuclear power plants being in the middle of a war zone. Should they be concerned?
Well, you should be concerned. The likelihood of it depends on the magnitude of any attack that might occur. And as I've said, it's extremely robust. The plant's extremely robust, and mostly it would be a area, as we saw at Chernobyl and Fukushima, would be an area around the plant that would be most susceptible to damage. However, after Fukushima and after Chernobyl, we learned a lot of lessons from those accidents and learned many countermeasures that we can take to minimize the amount of radiation release from a reactor, regardless of the accident that might occur.
Dr. Casto, thank you very much. That was Dr. Charles Casto. He's a U.S. nuclear safety expert.
Thanks, Terry.
As you might expect, condemnations of the attack on the nuclear power plant have been pouring in, with world leaders blasting Russia's assault as reckless. In a tweet, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the attacks must cease immediately, calling them, quote, unacceptable. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson also called for an immediate end to the attacks on the nuclear plant, demanding that Russia allow unfettered access for emergency services. Well, for more, let's bring in our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane. Melinda, a nuclear power plant on fire in Ukraine. This raises memories of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. This is a horrifying prospect for many people.
Absolutely. And in fact, this plant, as you know, is the largest of its type in Europe, a great deal larger than Chernobyl. And you remember how far excess radiation was detected after Chernobyl. So indeed, this is an unprecedented attack that endangers not just Ukraine, but the entire region and potentially all of Europe. And people are absolutely expressing outrage. Boris Johnson, not only that statement that you just mentioned there, but in fact saying that we need to see another meeting of the Security Council of the United Nations to talk about this. And President Zelensky, as you also said, referring to this as nuclear terror and calling on European leaders to act. Now, in theory, and you and I have talked about this before, in theory, the entire attack on Ukraine, but certainly this attack, and by the way, even if the Russians say that it was at most a training facility that was affected here, nonetheless, the danger is enormous. This attack would, in theory, trigger Article 51 of the UN Charter, which entitles countries or groups of countries to exercise an individual or collective right of self-defense when the Security Council has not or will not act, until it acts, essentially. Will they do so? No, definitely not, because that would involve head-to-head confrontation with Russia. The Security Council is not going to act. Essentially, it is paralyzed because of Russia's veto in the Council. And without any Security Council resolution, no one else will act, particularly after the chilling discussion that President Macron had yesterday with President Putin, where Putin made it clear he's prepared to take this, as he said, to the end.
Speaking of calls for action, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, he said he has called for a no-fly zone over his country. Those calls for a no-fly zone are getting quite loud. Any chance of a no-fly zone being imposed by NATO or the UN?
No, again, because there is fear that that would provoke exactly the kind of nuclear confrontation that NATO and hopefully Russia want to avoid. So a no-fly zone has, in fact, been imposed in other conflicts, Iraq, Bosnia, Libya, over a designated area. The thing is, it has to be policed. That means you have fighter pilots up in the air ensuring that the perimeter is not violated. That would mean a potential confrontation between a NATO fighter pilot and a Russian fighter pilot. And don't forget that those Russian fighter pilots, they're hearing Vladimir Putin saying that he's prosecuting this war in order to prevent genocide and so on. That's what those fighter pilots have in mind in that confrontation. And therefore, what we've actually seen happen is NATO has now reset its deconfliction line. That's the famous red telephone, the hotline of communication with Russian officials, in order to be sure we don't have miscalculations that could trigger escalation. And certainly that's a reason that they, I think, will not act on those calls for a no-fly zone.
Mentioning NATO, NATO foreign ministers are meeting today in a special session. What can we expect there, Melinda?
More of the same. We'll hear professions of support for Ukraine itself. We will hear professions of resolve in regard to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, the collective defense provisions. We'll probably hear more announcements about what's being done to shore up the defensibility of the Baltics and other vulnerable countries. And undoubtedly, we'll hear more warnings to Vladimir Putin himself. Will any of it make a difference? Who knows?
Melinda, thank you very much for now. Our chief political correspondent.